Putin maybe believes that he's stronger. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the people who've remained in Russia are getting increasingly weary of this war. And you have had these protests by the mothers and wives of people who've been mobilized early on and have never come home, even for the, breaks that they were promised. So the thing about Russia is everything always seems stable until it isn't. So we may be surprised.
Well, let's talk about Alexei Navalny now, though, because we heard today, and indeed just in the news there, that he was set to be freed in a prisoner swap for a jailed Russian spy and 2 US citizens before he was killed in a harsh Arctic prison camp, according to his allies today. Western leaders and Navalny's colleagues said that President Putin's fiercest critic, who had called the invasion in Ukraine a crime and urged Russians to rise up, was murdered. Well, let's talk more about these claims with Angela Stent, former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and former senior NATO advisor who authored Putin's World Russia Against the West and with the rest. Angela, good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Glad to be on your show.
Really good to speak to you. When you heard that today, that he was set to be freed, what did you make of it? Is there any truth there?
I mean, I don't think anybody knows. I was a bit surprised because the man that Putin really wants to come back to Russia, and he told that to Tucker Carlson, indirectly without naming him in his interview with him a couple of weeks ago, is the Vadim Krasikov, who's a Russian assassin who's in jail in Berlin. And we know, the Russians have been trying to get this man out. And therefore, in the discussions from the U.S. side, particularly about 2 U.S. citizens, the Wall Street Journal correspondent
Evan Gershkovich. Yeah.
Right. And then the ex-Marine Paul Whelan. We understood that was part of the discussion, but it was complicated because the man's in Berlin. He's not in the U.S. So what surprises me is if Putin really did want this man out, then why has he now apparently made this deal impossible with the death of Alexei Navalny? So that's what's not clear. And of course, we don't know with Navalny. We know that in the long run, the Kremlin was responsible for his death. They poisoned him. They kept him under horrible conditions. Whether they actually killed him last week, people are still debating. So there's just a lot that we don't know about that.
Yeah.
But, it seems a little strange just that if Putin was about to get Krasikov back, that he didn't get him back.
Authorities initially refused to hand Navalny's body over to his mum, only relenting, I think it was 8 days after he died. Do you think one of the reasons they did relent in the end was because of the internal pressure that they were seeing within Russia, both within protests there and also, a fear about further repercussions and a fear of further uprising, around the 2-year anniversary of the war?
Yeah, I think Putin may have been, and the Kremlin may have been surprised by the reaction to Navalny's death. Even though, it's a very repressive country and you can get arrested, for criticizing anything. Thousands of people went out and they laid flowers at memorials for him. Some of the young men who did were immediately taken away and to the mobilization stations and told that they got to fight in Ukraine. But there has been not a huge outpouring, but there has been an outpouring against him, and there have been more on the anniversary of the war. There were also protests in a number of Russian cities, not just the big ones. So I think in the end, that's why the Kremlin decided to hand the body over. But don't forget, they've warned his mother that he cannot have a public funeral because clearly they fear what that would mean. People might come and there'd be big protests.
Yeah, Navalny's spokeswoman, Kira Yarmish, actually wrote on social media saying that they were looking for a venue where supporters could hold a public farewell for him. But the risk of people attending these public farewells is stark, isn't it?
It is, and that's why some people are speculating that a public, memorial service for him could be held outside of Russia, probably in one of the countries in Europe where you have a lot of Russians who've left after the war began.
Is Putin's position now, 2 years on from the Ukraine war starting, is he in a weaker position now than he was a year ago? Or do you think he's in a stronger position considering the advancements of Russian troops within Ukraine?
Well, it appears that he's still in a pretty strong position. Again, he weathered the mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin, and Prigozhin and his colleagues are all dead. And Russia has been doing somewhat better on the battlefield. They have taken Avdiivka and a couple of other small villages around it. And I think Putin maybe believes that he's stronger. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the people who've remained in Russia are getting increasingly weary of this war. And you have had these protests by the mothers and wives of people who've been mobilized early on and have never come home, even for the, breaks that they were promised. So the thing about Russia is everything always seems stable until it isn't. So we may be surprised.
Where does an uprising come from, though, within Russia, Angela? I mean, you talked about the mothers there and the wives of people who've been lost in battle in Ukraine. But with all that fear of the consequence, where's the most likely area? Would it not be from within the Kremlin itself?
I mean, that's possible, but, the Kremlin's a black box to everyone. It's run by people who all come from the intelligence agencies, and they know how to make everything secret. So it potentially could. We haven't seen any signs of that yet. All we've seen signs of is the people in the Kremlin all sort of repeat what Putin says and seem to support him. But it would only take one person, presumably, to start unraveling this system. But we haven't seen that yet.
What we do know about the Russian economy is that it's actually been a lot more robust than many Western politicians have expected. It initially dropped enormously after the war started, after those initial restrictions by America and the EU and the UK meant that a lot of its outsourcing of oil and gas couldn't go to Europe, but they found a new market in the Far East and the Middle East, and it's been robust, hasn't it? It's survived the initial shock much better than many commentators thought it would.
Right. Russia had the highest growth rate of any European country in 2023. But that's because it's on a wartime basis. It has a war economy now, and the defense industries are pumping out weapons and things like that, and that's what caused the economy to look quite good. Eventually, it will probably get overheated. But as we know, Russia is still selling oil and gas to many different countries, and there are a number of countries that are helping it evade these energy sanctions, which is, why the U.S. and Europe have just recently imposed more sanctions. I don't know whether that will do anything to stop this evasion of the sanctions. But yes, I think everyone was surprised that the Russian economy, after faltering at the beginning, has done much better than people had anticipated in the beginning.
Angela, what type of sanctions need to be brought in then to have more of a heavy effect on the Russian economy? Or is it actually that more pressure needs to be put on Middle Eastern countries and Far East countries in order that they slow or stop their business with the Kremlin?
Well, I think maybe instead of thinking about different sanctions, one should also think about using either with the principle, at least, of the $300 billion of Russian frozen assets. I believe that the UK has said that
it's been talked about.
To think about doing it. Exactly. The US still hasn't come out quite in favor of it, and certainly most of that money's in Europe. So at least if that money were given to Ukraine, which would enable Ukraine to fight back more, I think that might be somewhat more productive. And then, the problem with the U.S. is that the Biden administration has now said that American LNG exports should cease in a few years. And then if you think about, where are Europeans and other people going to get their LNG from?
Yes.
They've been getting it from the U.S., but also Russia. So this would be actually a boon for Russia. So I don't know that there are many more sanctions that can be more effective, but there are other things that can be done to help the Ukrainians in this fight against Russia and to ensure that, Europe doesn't become more dependent on Russian hydrocarbons.
Do you know what? It's such a really amazing point. The reliance on LNG from the States and places like Qatar, and the speed at which that's switched around. And a lot of that comes into ports in the UK. I was actually lucky enough I went on board a ship that came from New Orleans and came into Kent in the UK. And
Yeah.
all that LNG, it comes across the Atlantic. A lot of it comes into British ports and in South Wales or in Kent, and is then pumped across the English Channel on interconnecting pipelines into much of Europe. I made a documentary about it last year, and it was fascinating to see the speed at which that change of energy supply, that the route has been completely recalculated. And if Biden does, cut off LNG, but he's going to be under enormous domestic pressure not to do that because of the economic consequences, isn't he?
Yeah, I think he is. So at the moment, they've said that this is going to stop in a few years, but there's still contracts that can be completed in the next few years. So we'll have to see whether that actually happens.
And Trump's not going to stop that if he gets in, is he?
Oh, no, of course not.
No. Angela, always
always
good to speak to you. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Angela Stent, the former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia, former senior NATO advisor as well, joining us on the show tonight. Really good to get her thoughts there on that Alexei Navalny story.